What if the man who sat across from you every evening eating ramen from a cracked bowl, wearing faded jeans with a hole in the knee, the man who laughed at your jokes and listened to every single word you said like it was the most important thing he'd ever heard? What if that man was secretly the heir to one of the most powerful families in all of South Korea? And what if you, a curvy black American kindergarten teacher from Atlanta, Georgia, who had spent years feeling invisible in a city that didn't always know what to do with you? What if you were the only woman in the world who passed his test? That's not a fairy tale. That's Rose's story. Let's set the scene. Seoul. A Tuesday morning that smells like rain and street food. A kindergarten classroom decked out in rainbow streamers and paper stars hangs from the ceiling like tiny wishes. And in the middle of it all, moving like she has somewhere to be and someone to love, there is Rose Williams, 28 years old. Originally from Atlanta, where the summers are thick and her grandmother made sweet potato pie every Sunday. Now living in a small but cheerful apartment in Mapogu, Seoul, where she has managed to cram a record player, 3 overfull bookshelves, a bright orange couch and more houseplants than is strictly sensible into 400 square feet of borrowed space. Rose is a plus-size woman. Curvy, full-figured, gloriously round in all the ways that made her self-conscious for years and proud now, most days. She has warm, deep brown skin, full cheeks that bunch like little pillows when she smiles, thick thighs that fill out her bright floral skirts, and a soft belly she has made peace with, mostly. She wears colorful cardigans in shades that make her kindergartners reach for her like she is made of joy. She wears glasses with tortoiseshell frames that are always slightly crooked. She wears sensible flats because she is on her feet all day and she is not about to suffer for fashion. She has a laugh that fills rooms. A hug that could fix a bad week. A heart so generous it sometimes gets her into trouble. But here is the thing about Rose. She has also learned what it means to be black and plus size in a city where the beauty standard is narrow and specific and she is, by every measure, neither. She has sat in restaurants and watched couples get greeted before her. She has downloaded dating apps and stared at matches going quiet. She has heard the whispers, not always unkind but always there, and she has learned to hold her head up through them. Not because it doesn't sting. It does. But because Rose Williams did not cross an ocean to make herself small. She came here for the children. For the work she loves. For the adventure of a life that is entirely hers. She just didn't expect love to come riding up on a delivery scooter in the middle of a rainstorm. His name, he tells her, is Lee Min-suk. He is a chicken delivery rider, 29 years old, living in a tiny room above a fish market that apparently smells exactly as bad as you're imagining. He has quiet eyes and a calm voice, and when her own scooter breaks down at the side of a rain-soaked street at 9 o'clock at night, he is the one who stops. Not because he is paid to. Not because he wants anything. Just because she is standing there in the rain with a broken scooter and a bag full of kindergarten craft supplies and she looks like she is trying very hard not to cry. He buys her tteokbokki from a pojangmaka around the corner. They eat standing up under a blue tarp while the rain hammers the awning. She tells him her name. He tells her his. She makes him laugh with a story about a 5-year-old who told her she looked like a happy cloud. He tells her that doesn't sound like an insult to him. She decides she likes him. What Rose does not know, what she cannot know not yet, is that Lee Min-suk is not his real name. His real name is Choi Hyun-woo. And he is the only son and heir of Choi Sung-min, a man known quietly in certain circles as the Shadow King of Busan. A man whose family controls a vast and discreet business empire worth more than most people will see in 100 lifetimes. Hyun-woo has done this before. The test. Dress like a delivery rider. Live cheaply. Find out who loves him. Not the family name, not the money, not the future inheritance. 3 women before Rose were brought close and eventually shown the cracks in the illusion. The desperate rent, the second-hand furniture, the life with no financial cushion. 3 women, when faced with a man who appeared to have nothing, eventually let their kindness cool. Rose does not know any of this. Rose just knows that the delivery rider made her feel seen on the worst Tuesday of her month. And this right here, is the story of how a curvy black teacher from Atlanta, Georgia, without trying, without performing, without being anything other than exactly who she already was, passed the most important test of love she never knew she was taking. Stay with me. This one is going to make you feel everything. Hey friends, real quick, drop in the comments right now, where are you watching from today? And if you were Rose, discovering the man you fell for was secretly a mafia boss's son pretending to be broke the whole time, what would you do? Stay and give love a chance or walk away? Let me know below. The alarm went off at 6:15, and Rose Williams silenced it with the practiced, exhausted grace of a woman who had been doing this for 3 years. She lay in the dark for exactly 45 seconds. She had timed this once out of curiosity, and stared at the ceiling of her apartment in Mapogu. The ceiling had a water stain in the corner that she had long ago decided looked like a rabbit mid-leap. She called it Gerald. Gerald was her first company every morning. "Okay," she said to Gerald. "Another one." She sat up. The apartment was small, but it was hers, and she had made it feel that way with everything she had. The orange couch with the throw pillows in mustard yellow and forest green. The record player she'd shipped from Atlanta at great personal expense, which her mother had said was absurd and which Rose maintained was absolutely necessary for the preservation of her soul. The watercolor prints of magnolias and soul alleyways she'd mounted in mismatched frames along the entry wall. The kitchen windowsill lined with succulents in small terracotta pots that she had named, all of them, after black women she admired. She shuffled to the bathroom in her thick-soled slippers and stood in front of the small mirror, wiping the steam from her evening shower off its surface with the side of her hand. She looked at herself. This part of the morning used to be the hardest part. There had been a time, a long time, a teenage years stretching into young adulthood time, when Rose avoided mirrors if she could help it. When she layered clothes to hide rather than express. When she shrunk into boots at restaurants and tried to take up as little space as possible on public transit and apologized for things that did not require an apology. That woman still lived somewhere in her, quiet and watchful. Rose knew that. But she had done the work. The therapy, the journaling, the friendship with her own reflection. She had read the books and taken the walks and built the life. And so now she stood in front of the mirror on a Tuesday morning and looked at herself the way you look at something you have learned, through real effort, to love. Full cheeks. Round face. The reading glasses she needed more every year, today's pair in tortoiseshell, sitting crooked because they always sat crooked. Her hair in a silk-wrapped pineapple at the top of her head. Her skin deep and warm and brown, slightly dry at the elbows because she kept forgetting to moisturize. Her neck, her shoulders, her arms, full and soft. Her belly round under her sleep shirt, moving gently with every breath. "You are fine," she told her reflection. "Not fine like perfect. Fine like functional. Fine like ready. Fine like present." She got dressed in a lavender cardigan over a white blouse, wide-leg navy trousers, and her most comfortable flats in the color of red clay. She pinned her kindergarten name badge to her cardigan lapel, Ms. Rose, Room 7, and tied on her apron. Today's apron was bright yellow with small printed suns all over it. She had 7 aprons. One for each day of the week, even though she only worked 5 because she liked having options and she liked how they made the kids light up. She made coffee in her little French press. She ate a banana and a piece of toast with peanut butter and honey, standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt too slow for a Tuesday. She watered the succulents. "Good morning, Cicely." "Good morning, Tony." "Good morning, Nina." And then she pulled on her coat, grabbed her tote bag heavy with kindergarten craft supplies and headed out. The subway ride to the school took 22 minutes. Rose had a personal rule about the subway. She sat down if there was a seat available. She had learned this rule the hard way from a year of standing because she was self-conscious about whether she fit, whether she took up too much space, whether someone would look at her. Now she sat down. She put in her earphones. She listened to whatever album she was working through that week. This week, an old Solange record she'd been meaning to revisit, and she let herself be carried. The school was a small international kindergarten in Siadimangu, a cheerful building with yellow doors and a mural of cartoon animals along the outer wall that the students themselves had painted last spring. Rose had been teaching here for 3 years now. It had started as a 2-year contract, an adventure, something to do after a difficult breakup and a year of feeling stuck in Atlanta. She had expected to come, teach, absorb the experience and go home. She had not expected to fall in love with the work the way she did. Kindergarten, people said, like it was simple. Like it was babysitting with finger paint. Rose had believed them a little before she started. Now she knew better. Kindergarten was the whole world in miniature. It was where children first learned that they had a self separate from their parents, that other people had feelings too, that conflict could be resolved without crying, or sometimes with exactly the right amount of crying. It was where they learned to write their names and tie their shoes and that some days were just hard and that was allowed. Rose loved it the way she loved good music. Fiercely. Completely. Without embarrassment. She greeted the security guard by name. She stopped to look at the new drawings posted by the entrance. A series of self-portraits done in crayon, wildly expressive, each child rendered in whatever shade they decided captured them best. One child had drawn herself in bright orange. One had used purple. Rose's own class had done this project last month, and she found 4 of her students' self-portraits in the row. Bold, colorful, fearless self-representations from children who had not yet been taught to be ashamed of what they looked like. She stood there for a moment, looking at those drawings, and she felt the familiar tug in her chest. You used to not know how to do that, she thought. And now you're teaching other people's children to do it easily. She took a breath and went to her classroom. Room 7 was loud within 20 minutes of arrival. Rose had 17 5-year-olds, a teaching assistant named Mrs. Bay who was unflappable and efficient and whom Rose trusted completely, and a classroom decorated with more color than a paint factory. There were learning stations and a reading corner with a bean bag in the shape of a large caterpillar and a small indoor garden where the children grew bean sprouts in plastic cups and checked on them each morning with the gravity of scientists. The morning passed in the particular blur of early childhood education. Songs and transitions and small disputes over the purple crayon and a child named Yoonji who cried for 10 minutes because her triangle wasn't a perfect triangle, and Rose sat with her on the floor and held her hand and told her that every triangle she would ever draw was perfect because she drew it, and watched Yoonji absorb this information slowly, like water into dry earth. At lunch, Rose ate in the staff room with Mrs. Bay and 2 other teachers. The conversation was mostly in Korean, which Rose could follow now with reasonable competence. 3 years of evening classes and total daily immersion did their work, though she still reached for words sometimes like fishing in a deep pond. She liked her colleagues. They were kind to her mostly. But there was always a slight distance, a pause, a quality of consideration before full warmth that Rose had learned to recognize and not take personally. She was a Black American woman in a Korean school in Seoul. She was also big in a country where small was the standard. She was foreign in 3 different directions simultaneously. The kindness was real. The distance was real too. She had stopped expecting one to cancel out the other. After school, Rose had craft supplies to restock, a parent email to answer, and a report to finish for the school director. She stayed 2 hours past her official end time, a habit she couldn't break, and when she finally stepped outside, the sky had turned the color of old graphite and it was raining. Not politely raining. Not the thin soul mist she'd learned to call rain in her first year here. Actually raining, thick and cold and purposeful, like the sky had a point to make. Rose stood under the school awning and looked at her scooter, her second-hand, cheerfully dented, reliably functional blue scooter that she used for errands and grocery runs and the occasional evening exploration when the subway felt too contained, and she thought, with the weary affection of someone who has been let down by a vehicle before, "Please don't do this to me tonight." She did it to her tonight. The engine clicked and guttered and died. Rose tried 3 times, each attempt progressively less optimistic, and then sat on the wet scooter seat in the rain holding the handlebars and staring at nothing. She was 14 minutes from the nearest subway station, uphill in the rain with a tote bag full of large foam letters, a roll of crepe paper in 5 colors, 34 small paper plate faces, and her own personal belongings. She did not have an umbrella because she had told herself last week that she needed to buy an umbrella, and she had, as she often did, not bought an umbrella. She pulled out her phone to call a taxi. No available taxis in the area. Of course. She was working out whether to attempt the walk or just sit on the scooter in the rain indefinitely when a delivery scooter slowed to a stop beside her, its headlights sweeping the wet ground. The rider was wearing a rain-soaked black jacket and a yellow helmet. He lifted the visor. Quiet eyes. A calm, open face. A small takeout bag attached to the back of the scooter. "You okay?" he said in Korean. Then, as if he'd clocked something in her expression, switched to simple, careful English. "Broken." Rose looked at her scooter. She looked at the rain. She looked at this stranger who had stopped, apparently for no reason, to check on her. "Very broken," she confirmed. He got off his own scooter. He crouched down and looked at hers with the quiet attention of someone who didn't necessarily know what he was looking for but wanted to appear useful. He tapped the engine housing. He straightened up and tilted his head. "I can't fix," he said honestly. "But." He pointed down the block. "Tekbaki. You hungry?" Rose looked at the stranger in the rain offering her tekbaki with the calm confidence of someone who had solved the core problem. She laughed. Genuine, loud, surprised. The laugh that filled rooms. "Yeah," she said. "I'm hungry." His name was Lee Minsuk. He was, he said, a delivery rider, lived nearby, didn't mind the rain because delivery riders couldn't afford to mind the rain. He said this matter-of-factly, without complaint, and bought her a cup of tekbaki from a pojangmaka around the corner where the elderly vendor knew him by name. They stood under the blue tarp while rain hammered the awning, shoulder to shoulder, eating rice cakes and red sauce with small wooden skewers. Rose told him about the day. About Yoonji and the imperfect triangle. His eyes, and she noticed this immediately because she was a kindergarten teacher and she noticed eyes, the way they changed when people were really listening. His eyes were completely present. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't look anywhere else. "She sounds smart," he said about Yoonji. "Knowing when something matters." "She's 5, Rose said. "Everything matters when you're 5. Maybe that's the right way." Rose looked at him. He was eating his tekbaki and looking out at the rain, and he said that like it was obvious, like the insight cost him nothing, and she felt something small and warm settle in her chest. She told him her name. He told her his. She mentioned the self-portrait project and the child who'd drawn herself in orange, and he said that sounded like a child who already knew something important about herself. Rose agreed. He walked her to her apartment building. Carried her tote bag without asking. When she offered to pay him for the food, he waved it away with a slight, almost embarrassed shake of his head. "Tell me about the kid in orange sometime," he said at her door. "You won't remember to ask," she said. "I'll ask," he said simply. He walked back into the rain. Rose stood in her doorway holding her bag of foam letters and stared after him until he turned the corner. Then she went inside and sat on her orange couch and looked at Gerald on the ceiling. "Ha," she said. Gerald had no opinion. But Rose's chest, for the first time in a long time, felt genuinely warm. The second time Rose saw Lee Min-suk, she hadn't gone looking for him. She was coming out of the small grocery store on the corner of her street, carrying a bag that contained, among other things, the ingredients for the dish she had developed over the past year and a half that she privately considered her greatest creative achievement: mac and cheese with gochujang. She had started making it as a homesick experiment and had refined it over 17 iterations into something she was genuinely proud of: creamy, deeply savory, with a low and persistent heat that snuck up on you pleasantly. She had tried to explain it to her mother over video call, and her mother had said, "Rose, that sounds like a mistake," and Rose had said, "Mama, you would cry." Min-suk was leaning against the wall outside the store eating a convenience store triangle kimbap with the tired efficiency of someone eating because fuel is necessary rather than because food is enjoyable. He saw her at approximately the same moment she saw him. There was a second of mutual startled recognition, the kind that happens when someone you've been thinking about lightly and unexpectedly appears in front of you. "You live near here?" she said. "Above the fish market," he said. 2 streets over. She knew the fish market. She had walked past it many times and thought, sympathetically, about anyone who had to sleep in proximity to it. "How's the scooter?" he asked. "At the mechanic's. For probably the rest of my financial life." She shifted her grocery bag. He was still eating his triangle kimbap. Something about watching someone eat alone in a doorway with that particular quality of solitary, matter-of-fact tiredness made something in Rose's generous heart tighten. "Are you hungry?" she said. "Actual food hungry?" He looked at the kimbap. Then at her. "I'm fine. I'm making mac and cheese with gochujang," she said. "It sounds strange. It's the best thing I make. Come eat." He came. That was the beginning of the 3 weeks that Rose would later think of as some of the easiest, fullest weeks of her entire time in Seoul. She had not had this before. Not here. She had friends, 2 fellow expat teachers she met for coffee on Saturdays, a woman from her Korean language class who was warm but busy with her own life. But she had not had this easy intimacy, this falling into someone's company the way you fall into a familiar chair. It surprised her. It pleased her. It made her walk to school with something that took her a few days to identify as lightness. Min-suk had no set schedule, delivery shifts were irregular, he explained, and so there was no formal arrangement, just a naturalness to his appearing. He would text, simple messages, a few characters, "Free tonight?" Or "Tekbaki place has new menu," and she would respond, and either she went to him or he came to her. And the evenings had a quality she hadn't found easy to manufacture before. Genuine, unforced ease. In her apartment, they watched Korean dramas on her laptop. She had subscriptions to 2 streaming platforms and strong opinions about narrative structure. And she provided the running commentary she gave to all television, which was detailed, enthusiastic, and often louder than the dialogue. He watched her watch the dramas with what she could only describe as quiet delight, like he was getting more entertainment from her reactions than from the show itself. "You're very emotionally invested," he said once, when she had stood up from the couch to yell at a plot development she found implausible. "They spent 8 episodes building that relationship," she said, pointing at the screen. "8. And now he's going to ruin it because of a misunderstanding he could resolve with 1 sentence. This is how Korean dramas work." "I know how Korean dramas work, Min-suk. I have watched 63 of them. That does not mean I have to like this part." He laughed. Fully, genuinely, a laugh that she realized she didn't hear from him often and so noticed when she got it. It was a good laugh. Quiet but real. She made food. This was how she loved people. She had known this about herself since childhood. She made food and she shared it, and something in her relaxed when people ate what she made and looked satisfied. She made the mac and cheese with gochujang on the 3rd visit and watched him take the first bite and then pause and look at the bowl with an expression she recognized. "You didn't expect it to be good," she said. "I didn't expect it to be this good," he said, which was more honest and therefore more charming. She made him kimchi pancakes with her own twist, a technique borrowed from her grandmother's potato pancake recipe, and a bulgogi-inspired beef dish she'd spent weeks figuring out. He ate everything and was not performative about it, not complimentary in the way people were sometimes complimentary to be polite. He ate the way people eat when they mean it. In the evenings they talked. This was the thing Rose had not expected and found most valuable. He talked. Not excessively. Min-suk was by nature a quiet person, but when he talked he was present and real and there was no performance in it. He asked her questions and listened to the whole answer. He told her about his childhood. He was vague about details she noticed but vivid about feelings. He had grown up in a house where expectations were enormous and warmth was scarce. He had spent most of his adult life, he said once carefully, being looked at rather than seen. Rose understood this with her whole body. It was in the second week that he mentioned, casually and with the flat effect of someone describing a minor logistical inconvenience, that his landlord was raising his rent at the end of the month and he wasn't sure if he could cover it on delivery earnings. He didn't ask her for anything. He mentioned it and moved on the way you mention a headache, not seeking rescue, just reporting a condition. Rose thought about it for 2 days. She had a storage room. Small, interior, no window, currently holding 3 boxes of her excess belongings, her backup air purifier, and a folding table she'd bought optimistically for hosting dinner parties that her apartment was too small to accommodate. The storage room had a power outlet and a built-in closet rod, and she measured just enough floor space for a narrow cot and a small side table. She cleaned it out on a Saturday morning. She moved the boxes to the corner of her living room. They looked terrible and she would deal with them later. She swept the floor and put down a small rug in deep blue. She found the most compact folding cot she could order online, and a flat pillow and a blanket in the same cheerful colors she used everywhere in the apartment. When Min-suk came over that Sunday she showed him. "You can stay here," she said. "The rent problem. This fixes it for now anyway." She said it the way she said most things she was sure about, matter-of-factly, without apology. "No charge. Just clean up after yourself and don't eat the last of the coffee without replacing it." He stood in the doorway of the storage room for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not just gratitude, something more complicated than gratitude, like a man who was being asked to process several things at once. "Rose," he said. "You don't have to decide now," she said easily. "But the room's there." He moved in on Tuesday. Rose found that having him in the apartment changed the texture of coming home. She had lived alone for all 3 years in Seoul and she had been good at it. She was genuinely good at being alone, but there was something about the small signs of another presence that she hadn't known she was missing. His delivery jacket on the hook by the door. The sound of him moving quietly in the storage room. The coffee already brewing when she came out on the mornings he rose early. She noticed that he was considerate in the precise ways that people are considerate when they are trying not to take up too much space, and she recognized this behavior because she had spent years practicing it herself. He folded his blanket. He washed his dishes before she woke up. He asked before using the last of anything. One night, after she'd had a hard day at school, a parent meeting that had gone sideways, a colleague who had said something about her Western approach, that was not unkind but was not entirely kind either. She sat on the orange couch and said nothing for 20 minutes and he sat with her and said nothing too, and at the end of it she felt better in the specific way she only felt better when someone hadn't tried to fix her, just sat with her. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not talking." He nodded like this made complete sense to him. And Rose looked at this quiet man living in her storage room eating her cooking and watching dramas with her, and she thought, with the bright clarity of something she'd been working up to for 2 weeks, "I really genuinely like you, Lee Min-suk." She did not say it out loud. She put it in her chest carefully and went to water the succulents. The rooftop of Rose's building was, technically, a utilitarian space. Exposed concrete and a water tower and 3 satellite dishes that she had named on a slow Sunday afternoon: Bernard, Gertrude, and the small one. There were 2 plastic chairs that had been up there since before Rose moved in and which she had never removed because sometimes, on good evenings, the rooftop was exactly the right kind of place to be. It was a Saturday in October, 6 weeks after the rain in the Takbaki, and the air had the first real cold in it, not brutal yet, just declarative, the way autumn announces itself in Seoul. The city was spread out below them in layers. The lit windows, the moving lights of traffic, the pale glow of convenience store signs, the dark shapes of mountains just visible at the horizon. Rose had 1 can of beer. Min-suk had declined to grab one for himself. "I'm fine," was his default, she had noticed, so she was holding it and they were sharing it, which she found quietly and completely charming. She hadn't meant to end up on the rooftop. They'd had dinner, she'd made jjajangmyeon from scratch, which was a project, and the result had been good but not perfect, and she'd spent 10 minutes critiquing her own noodle sauce until Min-suk had very gently taken her chopsticks out of her hand and redirected her attention. and then she'd said she needed air and he'd come with her, naturally, without being asked. They'd been sitting in the plastic chairs for 40 minutes. Talking, then not talking, then talking again. The easy alternation between the two that Rose had started to take for granted. It was in a quiet stretch that she said it. She hadn't planned to say it. She had a list, somewhere in the back of her mind, of things she didn't talk about early, not because she was ashamed of them but because she had learned to guard the soft places, to not hand them over until she had some sense of where they were going. And yet, there was something about this particular rooftop, this particular cold air, this particular man sitting next to her in a thin jacket that was not warm enough for October and which she had already offered to supplement with a borrowed sweater and he had politely declined. "Do you know what the worst part of living here is?" she said. "Not sad. Conversational, the way she often was when she was saying something she meant." He looked at her. Waited. "Being invisible," she said. "Not all the time. Not with you. But, in the general. On the street, in shops, in the staff room sometimes. I'm twice the size that's considered normal here and I'm black and I'm foreign. I'm about 6 different kinds of wrong at once." She said this without bitterness. It was an inventory, not a complaint. "I've gotten used to it. That's not the same as it not being there." "You don't seem invisible," he said. "That's because you're looking," she said. She took a sip of the beer. "Most people aren't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you stop it from," he searched for the word, "shrinking you?" Rose turned the question over. She had good answers to this question. She developed them over years of sitting with it, and she gave him the real one, not the polished one. "I got tired," she said. "I was so tired of deciding every morning whether I was okay. Whether I was allowed to take up the space I was in. Whether today was a good enough body day to deserve the things I wanted." She pulled the sleeves of her cardigan down over her hands. "I was 23 and I was exhausted. And I thought there has got to be something better than this. So you decided." "I decided," she said. "Some days I'm better at it than others. But yeah, I decided." Minsuk looked out at the city. She watched his profile, the quiet, still face that she had learned held more than it showed. "Why are you so kind?" he said suddenly. It came out like something he'd been holding, like a question he'd been sitting on for a while. She laughed softly. "What? To me? To the children? To people? You just..." He stopped. Started again more carefully. "I have met people who have harder things than you. Who were less kind. Who used the difficulty as a reason." Rose considered this. She didn't rush to answer because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. "My grandmother," she said eventually, "used to say that kindness was a decision you made before the day started. Not a reaction to whether the day was good to you. She made the best sweet potato pie you've ever tasted. She made it for neighbors, for strangers, for people who hadn't been particularly nice to her." Rose smiled at the memory, the kind of smile that goes inward before it comes out. "I asked her once why she bothered with the people who didn't deserve it. She said, 'Baby, how would you know who needs it?'" She looked down at her hands around the beer can. "I just want to love someone fully. I've always wanted that. I want to give everything, not hold back because I'm scared of what they'll do with it. I spent so long holding back." She looked at him. "I don't want to do that anymore." The city hummed below them. Minsuk looked at her with an expression she couldn't name except that it was full. Like a room with good light coming in. "She sounds like someone worth becoming," he said. "My grandmother?" "You. What you just described." Rose looked at him for a long moment. Something inside her moved, a tectonic thing, slow and significant, the kind of shift that doesn't make noise but changes the landscape. She didn't say anything. She passed him the beer can. He took it, and they sat in the cold autumn air while the city went about its evening, and Rose felt the particular, specific, wonderful vulnerability of being known. She thought, "I am falling in love with this man." She did not say it. But she let herself think it, clearly and without fear, for the first time. And somewhere in the chair beside her, Choi Hyun-woo, who was supposed to be observing and reporting and keeping careful distance from his own feelings, was thinking something very similar. There was a market 3 blocks from Rose's apartment that she had been going to every Saturday morning since her first month in Seoul. It was not a tourist market. It was a real, neighborhood, old building market with vendors who had been selling from the same stalls for 20 years and who recognized her now, the round-faced black woman with the colorful cardigans who bought too many vegetables and always stopped to look at the second-hand houseware stall for longer than she intended. The Ajumma who sold seasonal produce knew that Rose liked her green onions in large bundles and would sometimes set one aside before Rose arrived. Rose had decided this was the most romantic thing that happened to her on a regular basis, and she had told her mother this, and her mother had said she needed to get out more. She started bringing Minsuk. It was his idea, actually, or half his idea. He had offered to carry her bags which she didn't need, but which she accepted because she had learned that some people offered help because they wanted to be present and the bags were just the excuse. They went at 9 in the morning when the market was busy but not yet the full Saturday rush, and they moved through it in the comfortable, unplanned way they moved through most things together. Slowly diverging and reconvening, finding each other at the next stall without needing to plan it. Rose taught him the vegetable vendors' names and the etiquette of the market, how to express appreciation for produce without being performative about it, how to carry the bags properly to balance the weight, which stalls had the best seasonal fruit. He was a quick study and a genuine one, the kind of learner who paid attention not because they were trying to impress but because they were actually interested. He, in turn, knew the fish vendors in a way she had never learned, had actual opinions about which dried anchovies had the best flavor and a brief conversation with one elderly vendor that left the man laughing broadly. Rose looked at him in this moment, easy and unguarded in a way he rarely was with people he didn't know, and filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things about him that mattered. In the afternoons they walked. Seoul was inexhaustible as a walking city. There was always a new alley, a new neighborhood, a small temple or a garden or a peculiarly shaped building she hadn't noticed before. They walked in the comfortable silence that had become their native language, the one that didn't require filling. She pointed out things she loved about the city, the paper lanterns outside small restaurants, the way certain streets smelled like pine and rice and cold air all at once, the impossibly narrow staircases that led to rooftop cafes. He listened and added things quietly, small observations, small connections. He was teaching her a card game that she was absolutely refusing to learn correctly. "You're doing it wrong again," he said one evening, seated at her kitchen table with a simple card deck between them. "I'm doing it the interesting way," she said. "The interesting way loses. Life isn't about winning, Min-suk. In this game it is." She played the wrong card on purpose and watched his expression cycle through exasperation and something that wanted very much to be a smile. She grinned at him from behind her cards, wide, unguarded, the smile that bunched her cheeks up toward her glasses, and he looked at her and lost the thread of the game entirely. On a Thursday she had a hard day. Not dramatically hard. The kind of hard that accumulates. A child had been upset in a way that she hadn't been able to fully resolve, which stayed with her. She'd had a conversation with the school director about classroom resources that hadn't gone the way she wanted. She'd gotten on the subway at the end of the day and sat across from a perfectly ordinary stranger who had looked at her, not unkindly, but with that particular quality of clinical observation she sometimes encountered, and she had felt, for the first time in weeks, that familiar low hum of not belonging. She came home quiet. Min-suk was in the kitchen making tea. He had started doing this, making tea when she came home, as naturally as if he'd been doing it for years. He looked at her and didn't ask. He put the tea in front of her and sat down and waited. She told him about the director conversation. He listened with that full attention he always gave, and then asked one question that got to the actual core of the problem and offered a perspective she hadn't considered. Practical and clear and unexpectedly useful. "How do you do that?" she said. "Do what?" "Cut straight to the thing. I have colleagues who talk to me for 20 minutes and I'm less clear after than before. You ask one question." He shrugged, a small, almost self-deprecating gesture. "I grew up around people who talked a lot without saying anything," he said. "You learn to listen for the actual problem." She looked at him across her kitchen table with the tea between them and thought, "Who are you?" It was not a suspicious thought. It was a wondering one. A tender one. He was someone she understood and didn't understand simultaneously, and she found that she was not anxious about the paradox. She was just curious. She spent that weekend redoing the storage room. This was, she acknowledged to herself, a grand gesture dressed as practicality. She had looked at the room, which was functional but not much more, and thought about how Min-suk made the tea in the mornings and asked before using anything and carried her market bags because he wanted to be present, and she wanted to give him a small piece of the care he offered her so easily. She bought a small shelf to replace the stacked boxes he was using. She found a reading lamp at the second-hand shop, a good one, warm light, weighted base, and a small succulent in a white pot. She repainted nothing because that would have been too much, but she hung a small framed print on the wall, a simple watercolor of a Seoul alleyway at dusk that she had 2 copies of and had never put up the second one. When he saw it, he stood in the doorway for a moment. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said simply. "I wanted to." He looked at the little room, the shelf, the lamp, the succulent in its white pot, the alleyway print, and she watched something in his face shift, something careful and guarded move sideways to make room for something else. "Thank you, Rose," he said quietly. She recognized that he meant more than the room. "Don't name the succulent something weird," she said, turning back to the kitchen. "I have a whole system." He named it after an alleyway in Busan she had never been to. She let it stand. The open day at Rosa's school was in the second week of November. It was the school's twice-yearly event for parents to visit, observe the classroom, look at the children's work, speak with teachers, and generally feel connected to what their children were doing every day. Rose took open days seriously, not anxiously but with care, the kind of care she gave to anything that involved her children's well-being. She had spent the previous week making sure the room was ready. Work displays thoughtful and legible, the indoor garden freshly watered, the self-portrait project mounted properly, a printed information sheet about what the class had been learning and where they were headed. She mentioned it to Min-suk casually and then added, almost as an afterthought, "You can come if you're curious. I don't have family here, so I always have one less person than everyone else." He came. She didn't have time to pay attention to him for the first hour. Open day was a controlled chaos of greetings and parent conversations and demonstrating the learning stations and answering questions, all of it in a blend of Korean and English that she navigated by instinct and preparation. She was wearing her finest cardigan, deep teal with small embroidered flowers at the cuffs, and her best flats and a bright scarf she'd bought last spring, and she moved through the room with the fluency of someone who understood it completely. She saw Min-suk standing near the indoor garden, looking at the bean sprout cups. One of her students, a boy named Juno who was watchful and curious and one of her quietest, had gone up to him and appeared to be explaining the entire growing process in detail. Min-suk was crouching down to eye level, listening with total attention. Rose saw this from across the room and felt something happen in her chest that she could only describe as recognition. Like a piece of information she'd been gathering, suddenly understood. There was a moment between parents, a brief opening, and she went to him. "He's been waiting to tell someone about the bean sprouts for weeks," she said quietly, nodding at Juno. "He knows everything about them," Min-suk said, equally quiet. "The exact number of days since planting, the daily growth rate, the ideal light conditions." He looked at her. "Where did you find these children?" "They find me," she said and smiled. He stayed for the whole open day. He stood at the edges, watched and did not intrude. But she was aware of him, the still, present shape of him near the door, and she found to her own surprise that his being there made her better, easier, steadier in the spaces between parents when she was regrouping. Later, walking home, she said, "Did you have a teacher you loved when you were little?" He thought about this. "Not at school," he said. "There was a man, a caretaker at the house I grew up in. He stopped. Restarted. He used to talk to me like I was a person." She heard everything in that sentence that he wasn't saying. The house he grew up in. The implication that this had not been the default. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago. That doesn't always matter." He glanced at her sideways, that glance she had come to know, the one that meant he was calibrating how much she could hold. And then, "He used to take me fishing on Sunday mornings. He never caught anything. He said the fish were not the point. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was." Pause. "He died when I was 16. Rose did not rush past this. She let it sit the way he let difficult things sit, with space and quiet around them. "I think he knew who you were," she said eventually. He didn't answer. But she saw the way his jaw moved briefly and she knew she had said the right thing. It was on the rooftop that evening, they kept returning to the rooftop, it had become their place without anyone deciding it, that she told him about being 14. She hadn't meant to. But he had given her something real and her chest felt open and the cold air made things easier to say, somehow. "When I was 14, she said, "I had this idea that if I lost weight everything would change. That I'd become the person I was supposed to be. The person who got asked to dances and whose photos people liked." She pulled her knees up on the plastic chair. "I did this terrible diet, didn't tell my parents, just stopped eating most things. For about 3 months. Min-suk said nothing. "Listen. My grandmother found out. She didn't lecture me. She just made me sit down in her kitchen and she made me eat, and while I ate she talked. She talked about all the women in our family, her mother, her grandmother, all the way back, and she described them. What they looked like. Full-figured, most of them. Beautiful. Powerful. Women who built things." Rose paused. She said, "Baby, do you know what you're trying to erase?" The city was doing its evening below them. Rose looked at her hands. "I cried for a long time," she said. "And then I ate the rest of the food. And I decided, or started to decide, it took years, that I wasn't going to apologize for taking up space." Min-suk was looking at her with that expression she had come to understand as his version of moved. Not demonstrative. Just present and full. "She saved you," he said. "She reminded me of myself," Rose said. "There's a difference." She hadn't shared that story with many people. She turned it over after she said it, checking whether she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was bad. She didn't. She felt light. She felt like she had handed something heavy to someone she trusted and discovered it didn't need to be heavy anymore. She realized, genuinely safe. With this person. In a way she had not felt safe with someone romantically adjacent in a very long time. She did not move toward him. She was not there yet. But she was closer than she had been, and she let herself feel that without immediately drawing back. She looked out at Sol. "Thank you for coming today," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it," he said simply. She believed him. The school fair happened on a Saturday the second week of December, and it was exactly the kind of organized, cheerful chaos that Rose was designed for. It was an outdoor event. The school had the courtyard tented and lit with string lights, with food stalls and games and a silent auction of children's art and a stage at one end where the kindergarten classes were performing in sequence. Rose's class was doing a short piece they'd been practicing for 3 weeks, a loosely structured retelling of a Korean folk story about the moon and a rabbit, which had been adapted by Rose in collaboration with her students and which now contained significantly more dancing than the original myth. She was backstage with 17 5-year-olds in rabbit ears and moon costumes when she looked through the gap in the curtain and saw Min-suk in the crowd. He was standing near the back, slightly apart from the larger family clusters, wearing his usual faded jacket. He had gotten there early, before the performance, before the fair fully opened, and she hadn't known he was coming, and the sight of him standing there simply, just there, without announcement or fanfare, made her chest do something complicated. The performance went beautifully. Yoonji's dancing was passionate and slightly improvisational, and the other children adjusted around her with the instinctive generosity of 5-year-olds who didn't know yet that this wasn't how performance worked. Rose stood in the wings and watched them and felt the particular emotion she felt every time her class did something publicly. Pride so big it was almost unwieldy, and an awareness always of how temporary this was, how they would grow and move on, and this specific version of them in rabbit ears would exist only in this moment. After the performance they walked the fair together. He bought her a cup of hot cinnamon punch from one of the food stalls. She won a stuffed animal playing a ring toss game. She was surprisingly very good at ring toss, and gave it to a small child nearby who had been watching with yearning. They listened to the choir performance from the older students and ate the small cakes sold by the school parents, and she introduced him to Mrs. Bay, who assessed him with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had seen everything, and gave Rose a look afterward that could only be described as appraising. It was a good day. Easy and full, and the kind of day that settles into you as a memory while it's still happening. On the walk home, December streets, cold air carrying the smell of street food and wood smoke, he was quiet in a different way than usual. She noticed. She had become fluent in his silences. This one had a different quality, weighted, a little careful. "What's wrong?" she said. "Nothing's wrong," he said, which she believed technically. But something was coming. They reached her building. She led them up to the rooftop because that was where they went when they needed to say real things, and they stood at the railing with the city below and the cold air around them, and she waited. He took a breath. "I have to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you respond." Something in her stilled. Not afraid. Just alert, the way she got when she sensed a room changing. "Okay," she said. He told her. Not everything, not all at once. It came in pieces, and she heard each piece land and settle before the next one came. His name was not Lee Min-suk. His name was Choi Hyunwoo. He was 29 years old, and he was from Busan, not from a small room above a fish market. His father was a man with considerable influence and a family business that spanned several industries. He had been living this way, the delivery job, the small room, the ordinary life, deliberately as a kind of test. Not of her, specifically, in the beginning. Of what was real. Of who saw him versus who saw the name and the future and the weight of everything that came with it. 3 women before, he said. Women his father had introduced him to, women from families that intersected with his. He had tried the same approach. He had watched each one, eventually, close off or step back when the financial picture looked difficult. Not because they were bad people. Because they were people for whom security and stability were requirements that he had appeared not to be able to offer. He had not planned for Rose. He said this carefully, not as a line but as a fact. He had not planned for her. She had not been part of any arrangement. She had been a woman in the rain with a broken scooter and a bag full of foam letters and a laugh like a room filling up with light, and he had stopped because she looked like she was trying not to cry, and everything after that had been real. Had been more real, he said quietly, than most things had been in a long time. He stopped talking. The city was very loud below them in the silence. Rose looked out at it. She did not look at him yet. She felt the shock moving through her. Not dramatic, not a collapsing kind of shock, but the kind that is cold and clarifying, like stepping out of a warm room into winter air. She felt herself processing. The storage room she had offered him, which he hadn't needed. The delivery job he'd had, which was apparently real but not necessary. The worn jacket. The triangle kimbap in the doorway. The practiced simplicity of his whole life, every detail of it. She thought about how genuine it had all felt. How much she had felt seen. Whether you could be seen by someone who was, simultaneously, seeing you without showing you all of themselves. She thought about the women who had failed the test. What had they failed exactly? Generosity? The capacity to love something ordinary? She thought about the night she had offered him the storage room without hesitation, not because she was performing anything but because she had looked at him and thought, this person needs something and I have it and so why wouldn't I? She thought about her grandmother. How would you know who needs it? She did not cry. She stood very still and thought all of these things and let them move through her and she breathed. Then she turned and looked at Choi Hyunwoo. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the calm, quiet face. Something underneath that, exposed, something that looked like genuine fear, the kind that is not about physical threat but about loss. She looked at him for a long moment. I need to think, she said. Okay, he said immediately. I'm not walking away right now. I just need to think. Okay, he said again. She looked back at the city. She let her breath out slowly. Hyunwoo, she said, using his real name for the first time quietly like she was testing the shape of it. Was any of it not real? He answered without hesitation. None of it was performance, he said. I wasn't playing a character with you. I was more myself with you than I've been in years. Rose absorbed this. Okay, she said finally. Okay. She went inside. He let her go. She stood in her apartment by herself, with Gerald on the ceiling and the succulents on the windowsill, and she held the whole thing in her hands like something new and fragile and not yet understood. She stayed up until 2 in the morning just sitting with it. She didn't see him for 3 days. This was mutual and understood. She had said she needed to think, and she had, and he had given her the space without making her feel bad about needing it, which she noted and appreciated. He had sent one message on the second day. I'm here when you're ready. No rush. She read it 6 times. She walked to school those 3 days and walked home and lay on her orange couch in the evenings and had the argument with herself that she knew she needed to have. Not out loud mostly. Internally, the way she processed things, in a running conversation with herself that covered all the ground. There was the lie or what felt like a lie. And she was honest with herself about this. It hurt. Not enormously, not in a devastating way, but in the specific way that the withholding of truth hurts when you thought you were standing in the full light of someone and discover there was a shadow you didn't know about. She had given him her storage room, her food, her grandmother's stories, the teenage diet and the mirror in the morning and the things she said on the rooftop because the cold air made them easier, and he had given her, in return, a self that was real and genuine in its feeling but not complete in its facts. That mattered. She sat with that. But she also sat with the other thing. The way he had listened. The way he had crouched down to Juno's eye level at open day and learned everything about bean sprouts with genuine attention. The tea in the mornings. The walks. The way he had said I was more myself with you than I've been in years without any performance, without any attempt to make it sound better than it was. He had been hiding a secret. But he hadn't been pretending to be kind. He hadn't been pretending to care. Those things were real. She had spent 3 years learning to read people. It was part of the work of teaching young children, learning to distinguish genuine emotional communication from performance, from manipulation, from need. She trusted her reading. And then there was the hardest question. The one she came to on the 3rd evening, sitting on her orange couch with a cup of tea she had made herself and Nina Simone on the record player, moving low and steady through the apartment. She asked it to Gerald on the ceiling. He said yes. If she opened this door again. His world was enormous. His family was powerful and complicated and wealthy in ways that she, a kindergarten teacher from Atlanta living in a 400-square-foot apartment with a second-hand record player, was not. He had grown up in a life that she could not fully imagine. She would be stepping into something that was not hers, that had rules she didn't know, expectations she might not meet. And then the second, quieter question, the one underneath the first, the one that was really about her and not about him at all. Did she think she was worthy of it? She sat with this one for a long time. Because this was where the work showed its value or it didn't. This was the moment where years of standing in front of mirrors and telling herself the truth, of making decisions before the day started, of refusing to shrink. This was where it counted. She thought about the women who had failed his test. She thought about what the test was really measuring. Not whether they had money, not whether they were smart or beautiful or accomplished in the conventional ways. Whether they had enough in them to give freely when the situation looked ordinary. Whether they could see value in a person who appeared to have nothing. Rose had passed the test not because she was trying to pass any test. She had passed it because she was Rose. Because that was how she had decided to be. She put down the tea. If Choi Hyun-woo, with all of his family and his history and his complicated world, chose her, curvy, black, ordinary kindergarten teacher Rose Williams from Atlanta, Georgia, then the question was not whether she was worthy of his world. The question was whether she was ready to choose him back. She called him on the third evening. He picked up on the second ring. "Can you come to the rooftop?" she said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. He was there in 7. He came up the stairs looking calm, that careful, controlled calm she had learned covered a lot, and found her standing at the railing, and he stopped a few feet away and waited. "I have a question," she said. "Okay." "Are you sure?" she said. She said it directly, looking at him. "Because I need you to actually think about this. I'm a black American woman. I'm plus size. I wear colorful cardigans and I make mac and cheese with gochujang and I name my succulents and I talk loudly at dramas. I'm going to do all of this in whatever world you're asking me to step into. I'm not going to change to fit something I don't understand yet." She held his eyes. "Is that the person you're choosing?" He looked at her for a long moment. The city moved below them. The cold air moved around them. "Rose," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name, deliberate, like he meant the whole word. "I lived in a small room above a fish market for 3 months specifically to find someone who sees people the way you see people. And I found you." Pause. "Yes, I'm sure." She looked at him. She breathed. "Okay," she said. She stepped toward him and he met her halfway and she let him hold her hands, her warm, round hands in his, and she looked up at him and she felt the fear recede, not because it was gone but because it was smaller than what was on the other side of it. "You're going to have to try the mac and cheese gochujang again," she said. "I would eat it every day," he said. She laughed, the room-filling laugh, and he smiled at her, the full smile she had seen only a handful of times and which was, she decided, one of the best things she had ever been given. The meeting with Choi Sung-min had been arranged for a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the rooftop. Hyun-woo had told her about it with the careful, measured approach she had come to recognize as his version of handling difficult news. Directly, without ceremony, but with enough gentleness to acknowledge that this was significant. His father wanted to meet her. This was not, he explained, a formality. His father did not do formalities for their own sake. It was his father deciding whether he would accept her. "And if he doesn't?" Rose had asked. "I would not have passed that test either," Hyun-woo said simply. She had believed him. She had thought about it anyway, the way she always thought about things, but she had believed him. The morning of the meeting, Rose stood in front of her mirror for longer than usual. She did not dress to diminish. She did not choose clothes to make herself look smaller or more acceptable or more Korean or less American. She stood in her closet and thought about what she wanted to wear to meet the man who had raised the person she was falling in love with, and she chose accordingly. A deep burgundy wrap dress, her best dress, the one that made her feel like herself in capital letters. Her good coat, the camel one with the wide collar. Her good flats in dark brown leather. Her hair down, natural in its full volume and texture. Her tortoiseshell glasses because she needed them and she didn't apologize for that. A small gold stud earrings her grandmother had given her for her 21st birthday. She looked at herself. She looked, and she thought this clearly, without false modesty or excessive reassurance, like herself. Like Rose Williams. Like someone who had decided years ago to take up her own space. "Okay, Gerald," she said to the water stain on the ceiling. "Here we go." The tea house was in a quiet part of Insadong. A narrow building with a wooden facade and a sign in traditional brushstroke script, the kind of place that looked like it had been there longer than the street it stood on. Inside, it was dim and warm with the smell of high-quality tea and old wood. A server led them to a private room at the back, sliding screens, a low table, cushions on the floor. Choi Sung-min was already seated. Rose's first impression was composed, deliberate calm. A man in his late 50s with Hyun-woo's quiet eyes and none of his softness, or not the same kind anyway. He was dressed simply for a man of his apparent resources, a well-made jacket, understated. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, with complete, careful attention. She bowed. Appropriately, at the right depth because she had been in Korea for 3 years and she had paid attention. He inclined his head. They sat. The tea was poured. Rose held her cup in both hands because she had been taught that this was respectful and because her hands needed something to do and she was not going to let them shake. She was nervous. She was honest with herself about this. The man across from her controlled things she didn't fully understand, and he was assessing her, and the stakes were not nothing. She felt the nervousness the way she felt it before every open day. It moved through her and she let it move and it did not take over. Choi Sung-min asked her questions. In Korean, initially, and she answered in Korean, and she saw something shift slightly in his expression. A small recalibration. He asked about her work. She talked about the children, about Room 7, about Yoonji and the triangle and the self-portrait project. She talked about it the way she always talked about it, with love and specificity, naming the children as individuals, describing their particular geniuses and challenges. She watched him listen. He asked why she had come to Korea. She told him the truth. She had come for adventure and for the work and because she needed to meet herself somewhere new. She said this simply without dressing it up. He asked what she wanted for Hyunwoo. She looked at him directly. I want him to be happy, she said. Not happy in the way that looks right from a distance. Happy in the way that makes the mornings easier. She thought of the tea he made before she woke up. She thought of the fishing with the caretaker who never caught anything, the fish not being the point. He spent a long time being looked at and not seen. I want to be the person who actually sees him. I want us to see each other. That's what I want. The room was very quiet. Choi Sung-min looked at her for a long moment. His expression gave nothing away and then gradually gave something small, a slight softening around the eyes. Not a smile. Something more considered than a smile. He told me, the older man said in careful, deliberate English, that you offered him your storage room before you knew his name. He needed somewhere to stay, Rose said. You did not ask why. I looked at him, she said simply. It seemed obvious. Another silence. He turned his teacup slightly in his hands. My son, Choi Sung-min said, has made a good choice. He said it quietly, with no performance, in the manner of a man who chose his words carefully and meant them fully. Rose felt the words land. She did not exhale dramatically. She did not cry. She held his gaze and nodded once and said, I know. A beat. And then, surprising her, the corner of Choi Sung-min's mouth moved. Not a full smile, but something in the direction of one. He drank his tea. They stayed for an hour. They talked, carefully at first and then with more ease, about Seoul and about Busan and about the school and about Hyunwoo when he was small and about a grandmother who made sweet potato pie and a caretaker who took a boy fishing with no intention of catching fish. They found, in the spaces between the careful conversation, small patches of common ground. When they left, Hyunwoo took her hand on the step outside the tea house. She looked up at him. He looked back at her. His expression was, she thought, the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open and warm and a little undone, in the way that people look when they have been holding something carefully for a very long time and have been allowed, finally, to set it down. He likes you, Hyunwoo said. I got that impression, she said. He doesn't like many people. He has good taste then? Hyunwoo laughed, that real, quiet laugh she had learned to treasure, and she leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and they walked out into the cold Insadong street with the winter sky going dark blue above the old buildings, and Rose Williams, curvy black kindergarten teacher from Atlanta, Georgia, felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has walked into a room as exactly themselves and been found sufficient. Better than sufficient. Welcome. By the following spring, Rose had a new succulent on the windowsill. She had acquired it from the Saturday market, from the old woman at the houseware stall who had taken to saving her things. It was a small, fat, deeply green succulent in a terracotta pot with a crack along one side. The vendor had tried to discount it because of the crack and Rose had said she would take it at full price. Thank you, the crack was not a problem, and the vendor had looked at her with the particular expression Rose had learned to recognize as Korean for you are a lot but in an affectionate register. She had named it Joy. She was watering it on a Sunday morning when Hyunwoo came in from a run. He had started running in the mornings, which Rose found very admirable and slightly unreasonable for a Sunday, and he stood in the kitchen doorway in his running gear looking at her water Joy and she looked up and said, Good run. Cold, he said. I told you March is still cold. I thought you were exaggerating. Minsuk, she said, using the name she still called him sometimes because she had built her entire understanding of him under that name and it still felt like an intimacy. I have lived in Seoul for 4 years. I do not exaggerate about March. He smiled at her, the full smile which she still received like something rare and specific, and went to make the tea. Her apartment had evolved. It was still small, still hers, still the orange couch and the record player and the mismatched print frames and the succulents named after black women, but there were new elements folded in. His running shoes by the door, a jacket on the hook, a second coffee mug that had appeared on the shelf one day and stayed. A book he was reading, turned face down on the corner table in a way that made her mildly insane because she had told him about the damage to spines and he maintained that the spine damage was not significant and they had a whole ongoing debate about this that was, she knew, not really about books. She was still teaching at the kindergarten. This had been, among the many things she'd had to decide about what her life with Hyunwoo would look like, The one non-negotiable. Room 7, her children, Mrs. Bay, the bean sprout garden. She had said this clearly, and he had said just as clearly that he would never ask her to give it up, and she had believed him, and so far she had been right. She had not changed her body. She had not changed her wardrobe or her hair or the way she moved through the world. She had met several members of the Choi extended family over the preceding months. At gatherings she had attended in exactly the clothes she would have worn anyway, the colorful cardigans, the wide skirts, the sensible flats, and she had shaken hands and been polite and been herself, and the people who were worth knowing had found her worth knowing, and the people who hadn't quite managed it were not, she had decided, her project. Choi Sung-min had come to Seoul twice. Both times at his request they had tea. He asked about the school each time. He had a way of listening to stories about the children that was unexpectedly engaged, as though kindergarten pedagogy was in fact interesting to him, which Rose suspected it was not, but which she appreciated as evidence of effort. On his second visit he had brought her a gift from Busan, a small celadon tea bowl, old, beautiful, wrapped in cloth. He had not made a performance of giving it to her. He had set it on the table and said simply that he thought she would use it. She used it every morning. She still had her Friday dinners. These had evolved over the months into a weekly gathering she hadn't planned. She cooked, and whoever was available came. Her expat teacher friends. A Korean colleague from the school who had started coming and brought her husband. Mrs. Bay, twice, who ate the gochujang mac and cheese with the studied expression of a woman reconsidering her assumptions and then came back for seconds. Hyunwoo always. These dinners were loud and warm, and someone always ended up on the orange couch with a second glass of whatever they were drinking, and the record player went, and sometimes a child had been brought by a parent and fell asleep in the reading corner that Rose had assembled in the space between two bookshelves, and Rose moved through it all like she had been meant for this, which was, she believed, because she had been. On a Sunday evening in late March they were on the rooftop. Bernard, Gertrude, and the small one still up there, unchanged. The plastic chairs which had survived another winter. The city below them in its perpetual lit motion. Rose had a cup of the good tea from the celadon bowl. Hyunwoo had his hands around a plain mug. The air smelled like spring coming in at the edges of the cold. "I've been thinking," Rose said. "About what?" "About the test." She looked at the city. "Your father's test. The whole thing." She turned the celadon bowl slightly. "Those other women, the ones who stepped back. I don't think they failed anything." He looked at her. "I think they just weren't made for it," she said. "Not for me, the life, any of it. Not because they were unkind. Because they were themselves and it didn't fit." She paused. "The test wasn't really about money. It was about whether someone would choose you without knowing what the choice was worth. Without it looking like a good investment." She looked at him. "And the reason I passed it, the only reason, is that I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was just thinking about whether I liked you." "Did you?" he said. "From the tteokbokki stand," she said. "Yes." He looked at her the way he looked at her on the rooftop the night she told him about her grandmother, about the 15-year-old mirror and the decision she'd made. Full and still. "You would have helped anyone in that rain," he said.